So this video is just very quickly about CPU rendering versus GPU rendering. And before I get into this stuff right here, I just want to start this off with something very typical that people look at and sort of go from there. So let's see if I can switch. There we go. So a very typical thing that happens when people start debating about CPU rendering versus GPU rendering is that they kind of go, well, GPU is way faster, and sort of try to end the conversation there, and that's it. And to me, that's a shame, because there's a couple of things that you need to know if you're looking to, let's say, invest into hardware, if you're switching over to Blender from something else and you're trying to figure out what the best way to work is for you. Now, first off, I'm going to show you something very quickly. We have a scene here that was rendered with one GPU that took about 12 minutes to render, and I have the same scene rendered on CPU, and this GPU and CPU are fairly comparable when it comes to price range. And obviously the CPU loses out a little bit and tends to be a little bit slower. So this is usually the trend, that GPUs of sort of in the same price bracket tend to be a little bit quicker, and people often dismiss this as GPU rendering is, you know, way better and CPU rendering sucks, which in my mind there's a lot more to it, and I want to talk about that very quickly to make sure that you're making the right choice. So if I go back here, we'll see CPU rendering versus GPU rendering, and there's really two main things to consider. The type of your project and scene complexity, so the type of things that you actually do, and your deadline time. So for the first part, the type of project, if you're doing anything that's like architectural visualization or anything in film and animation, generally CPU rendering will be more for you, because even though it renders a little bit slower than CPU, you have a lot more resources available to you. So that's what this sentence is all about. It all comes to RAM or VRAM. So basically, if you're rendering on your GPU, you're rendering on the RAM that your GPU has, and generally that's going to be a lot less than the RAM that's in your computer. So this basically means if you have a lot of complex scenes, you probably won't even be able to fit it on your GPU to render it out. So in that case, you don't really have a choice, and CPU is going to be your best friend. Now, again, I really want to avoid people thinking that I'm saying one is better than the other, and it really isn't. It really comes down to what you need. Same with deadline time. One of the main reasons that I like to use GPU rendering is because when I'm working for a client, I have very quick turnaround times. Sometimes it can be a week or 2 weeks to do an animation of a minute or even more, or even longer than that. And having multiple GPUs in one computer is really easy, and I can really speed up rendering and get things out very quickly and have happy clients. Now that being said, I've never really run into a lot of issues with GPU rendering yet, because I do a lot of motion graphics work, and generally the scenes aren't as complex, depending on how you look at it, of course, but I managed to get some stuff out very quickly because of this. If I'm doing more resource intensive stuff and I have a very complex scene with hundreds of textures and millions of polygons, chances are you're probably not going to be able to fit it on the GPU, so the CPU will be your best friend in that case. So I just wanted to sort of break through what some people say with this by saying it doesn't really matter what you use. If you're just rendering stills and you can leave them on overnight, then, you know, if you can do it on CPU and render it on CPU, you're probably going to be using a bit less power as well with your computer plugged into the wall. So those are things to consider too. Now, that's about it for this. I just want to talk about it very quickly. One isn't necessarily better than the other. It's good to know the limitations and advantages of both going in.